he says go, Ralph, you can start. No?
Welcome, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is a one-of-a-kind service. It's once a year, and this is the only time that we can be silly and act kind of crazy sometimes. I've got a few things I want to talk to you about. First is, you notice these boos and ahs and everything. We will tell you when to say them. Obviously, we have a bad character. It's boo. We have a beautiful queen. Ah. And we have another guy, we just say, Yay. All right. Mordecai. So here we go. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen and children of all ages. Come one, come all, and listen to a fantastic tale. Centuries old, but truer than most of the stuff you hear in the news today. That's actually true. Yeah. Welcome to our annual Megillah reading in Hebrew. The word Megillah means volume or scroll. Tonight we have a story of our favorite heroine, Esther. And every time you hear her name, we will all give a collective ah. There's also about our hero, Mordecai. Yay! Yay! For whom we will collectively say, yay, Mordecai, yay. Then there's the villain. Because what would a good story be without a nasty villain? Our villain's name is Haman. Haman. Oh. Boo, he's terrible, man. And we make a lot of noises and stuff with your noisemakers and things like this on purpose for blotting out his name because he was so terrible. Amen. And now I would like to introduce our illustrious reader for the adventure, Rabbi Allan Moorhead. Yay! Yay! And our lovely jester.
Yay! Yay!
That's Elder Letty in disguise. But she does make a wonderful jester. She's going to be assisting during this time. And be sure and enjoy yourselves today. Let yourselves loose. This is the sanctuary, the holiest of holies, but this is the time that God said that we could really enjoy ourselves in his house. And so let's do that. Let's remember to say, ah, yay. Ooh. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And let us begin.
Remember, after the program, you got your hamantaschen out there, cookies. Be sure to get some because they're shaped like a three-cornered hat, which is traditional what Haman would wear. Now, got to be on guard, because as I read, I might go quickly. Haman, Esther, Mordecai, back and forth. You got to be right on the money, or you'll be booing when you're not supposed to be booing, or yaying when you're not supposed to be yaying, back and forth.
Esther saying slow down.
Yeah. Just a little history before we begin. This is a true story. And the fact is that, remember in the Bible, God told Saul to kill and wipe out all the Amalekites. And he failed to do so, and he had his kingship taken away from him. And David became king. Well, the consequences of Saul not killing the Amalekites was a result of Haman down the line. Yeah. So some of the Amalekites fled to area later became the Persian Empire, and Haman rose out of that group. If Saul would have done his job, we would have never had the Purim or Esther thing we read about. So there is true history to this, what exactly took place. It's not just a Aesop's fable or anybody else's fable. It's a Bible story that's for real. Are we ready to begin?
Yes.
Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces, from India to Ethiopia. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which is in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him. And when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. That's a long party. 180-day party. Wow. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with the cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. Pretty fancy. And they served drinks in golden vessels, and each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, drinking was not compulsory. So the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. So they didn't force anybody to drink a certain amount of liquor, but they weren't going to stop them either. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Bitzdah, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, Carcass, and 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. So then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Carcena, Cethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence, and who ranked the highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to Queen Vashti, according to the law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus, brought her to her by the eunuchs? And Memucan said before the king and princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes, and all the people who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes. And when they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she did not come. This very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall no more come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another, who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king and the princes. And the king did according to the words of Memucan. And he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak the language of his own people. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servant who attended him said, "Let beautiful young women, virgins, be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, and to the women's quarters, under the custody of Hegal, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and so he did so. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shemel, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. Very good. His uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was when the king's command and the decree were heard, when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Hegal, that Esther was also taken to the king's palace, unto the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her. Besides her allowance. Hello. Did
Rabbi.
Did it go away? I'm going to switch mics real quick here.
Try this one.
Testing. Is this one on? Yay! It's on. All right. He readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. And Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai placed in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Each young woman turned to go into the king, Ahasuerus, after she had completed 12 months of preparation, according to the regulations for the women, for thus were the days of their preparation appointed: 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes, and preparation for beautifying women. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shaalgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called her by name. Now, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Hegal, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebet, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. And now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the commands of Mordecai, as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther. And Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. It is written in the book of Chronicles in the presence of the king. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set a seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were with the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" Now it happened when they spoke to him daily, he would not listen to them. And they told it to Haman, to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow, you guys are so good, or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lots, before Haman, to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples. They do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money and the people are given to you to do them as it seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, and a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all people, and to every province according to the script, and to every people in their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent out by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy and kill and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, to plunder their possessions. A copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Shushan was perplexed. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the middle of the city. And he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province there was king's commands and decrees arrived, and there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther, maids and eunuch came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, and whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai, to learn what and why this was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. And he also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man who or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, to put all to death, except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. And Mordecai told them to Esther. So, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go into the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did all according that Esther commanded him. Now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes, and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther, the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you unto half the kingdom." So Esther answered, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." And then the king said, "Bring Haman, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this: if I found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." So Haman went out that day joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And then Haman told them of his great riches and the multitude of his children, and everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, "Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I am going again to be invited by her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so as long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high. In the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, and then merely go with the king to the banquet." And the thing pleased Haman. So he had the gallows made. That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs and doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity have been bestowed upon Mordecai for this?" And the king's servant who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant said unto him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Yeah. Yeah. I would be choked up too. And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest upon its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai, the Jew who sits within the king's gate, and leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Afterwards, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said unto him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him. You will surely fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman, yay, boo. Yay, boo. He's not in this. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king said again to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done. Then Queen Esther answered and said, I have found favor in your sight, O king. Let me start over again. If I have found favor. She had to clear her throat. Excuse me. If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as a male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Ahasuerus said to the queen Esther, who is he, and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before the queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. And when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will you also assault the queen while I'm in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said unto the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. And the king said, hang him on it. A little ad-libbing there, okay. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that they had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was subsided. Yeah, I'd say that again. Yay! On that day, King Ahasuerus gave the queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king and fell down at his feet and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman, the Agagite, and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, then let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see evil that will come to my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai, the Jew, indeed I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourself write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So the king's scribes were called at that time, in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews and satraps, the governors and princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in his own script, and to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of the king Ahasuerus, and sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses, bred from swift steeds. By these letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that all the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on the royal horses went out, hastened, pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in the royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold, and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. In every province, the city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time had come for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. The opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. No one could withstand them, because the fear of them fell upon the people. And all the officials of the provinces and satraps and governors and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with a stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also in Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Arithatha, Parmatha, Arisai, Aridai, and Vajazatha, and the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done." And then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done, and the decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar, And they killed 300 men at Shushan, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives and had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. And this was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. On the 14th of the month they rested and made a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day, as well on the 14th, and on the 15th of the month they rested, and they made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews, near and far, who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. Of the days on, the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the months which had turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday. And they should make them days of feasting and days of joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions, according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, every city. These days of Purim should not fail to be observed. That's why we're doing it. Among the Jews, and that memory of them should not perish from among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai, the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with the words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai, the Jew, and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, that they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning the matters of fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and is written in the book. And King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might, and the accounts of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai, the Jew, was second to the king Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitudes of his brethren, seeking good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. And I say amen to that. Yay! Let's give a hand to Letty. She had the hard job there. Good job, Letty. Did you have something to say, Ralph?
No, I would just like everybody to thank our Rabbi and Elder Letty for their service tonight. I mean, it's difficult enough to change your voice several times. But, you know, we celebrate this because we're told to celebrate it for these reasons. And this is a beautiful holiday and a beautiful time in our lives. And I think that Allan, Elohenu, would say it's okay to do this in his sanctuary because it's his house. Amen. All righty.
Yeah. The yay went down, right? I do want to thank all of you for coming. And we don't forget the hamantash and cookies back there. And let's just have a glorious, wonderful time of fellowship tonight. You know, if Haman would have known the scriptures, he would have never tried to kill the Jews. Well, it's pretty clear in the scriptures what happens to the Jews, what does happen to them, but God always delivers them. He always delivers them. If Haman would have known those things, they wouldn't have dared try to do what they did to do. And it's the same today. Persia today has its Hamans today. There's a lot of Hamans in the world today. And if they would just know the scriptures, they would back off. But they don't, and they're going to be destroyed. You know, it doesn't mean that, the Israel won't have harm done to it. It will have a lot of harm done to it. But the bottom line is the Jews will survive. That's why Mordecai said that if you don't help Esther, then God will bring the help from somewhere else. Because Mordecai knew what the scriptures said and knew that the Jews will survive. And so Esther stepped up and did her role like she should have. Yes. Did Hitler do that?
Hitler's 10 right-hand men, his 10 top guys that he trusted were hung. My understanding is that they were hung on the same day that Haman's sons were hung.
That is correct. Yeah, and I'll explain it. The Bible codes. The Bible codes. I don't know if you're familiar with Bible codes, but a lot of history of the world, if not all the history of the world, is coded in the Bible. By equal distance letter skipping, they call it. So they had found after the trials of Nuremberg after World War II, that 10 of Hitler's henchmen, their names are encoded in Esther, right where the 10 sons of Haman were hung. So that's not by chance. God did that stuff. So he showed through Bible codes that there would be another Haman, and his 10 henchmen, which was Hitler, his 10 henchmen will be hung also, just like the 10 sons of Haman did. So yeah, you're right. The Bible codes is a very interesting. You can't tell the future with Bible codes, although there's been people trying to do it, because you don't know all the details. You know all the little things to be able to find it. You can find your own name in there somewhere, but you don't know whether or not that's a distant relative or you or who what, So probably the most famous thing of the Bible codes that occurred was that Israeli prime minister that was assassinated, Rabbi. They found him in there before it happened, where it was going to happen, and who was going to do it. They found that encoded in the Bible, and they tried to warn Rabin not to go to this place he was going to go. And basically they were saying, why? Well, we see it right in the Bible. He's going to be killed. Oh, you're crazy. And he went and he was shot and killed. And if it's already said that God's word does not come back void, it will accomplish that which it was intended. If it already said that he was going to die, there was nothing they're going to do about it. He was going to die. So even if you found out the truth, you're not going to stop it because it's God's word. a little scary, but that's what it is. When God's word went forth and said what he intended, it's going to be accomplished. And you cannot stop it. Right. Yes.
How many generations were between Haman and Saul?
Wow. How many generations between Haman and Saul? So you figured we're talking about 600 BC, and Saul existed probably about 400 years prior. So, depending on how many years you add to a generation. So if you figure, let's say 70 years a generation, 70 into 400 is what? How much? 6 or 7 generations, yeah. So God knew what he was saying when he told Saul to kill all the Amalekites. And when he failed to do it, the Jews suffered as a result of it. The bleeding sheep, I hear my ears. Do you know why God wanted the Amalekites destroyed? Besides saying it's going to happen and it had to happen, but
They were when the Israelites were in the wilderness, they would creep up behind them
that's correct.
and then kill the young in the lane that were.
On their way to Mount Sinai, the sick, the older ones were all always lagging behind. So the Amalekites attacked from the rear and killed the older and sick and people that were struggling to keep up with the rest of the, quote, herd. And so the Amalekites attacked there. That really upset God. So he told Saul, because of what they did, attacking my people from the rear that were struggling to keep up, wipe them all out. Let none live, not even the animals. But what did Saul do? He kept what he called the better of the animals for sacrifice. And that's when Samuel told him, it's better to obey than sacrifice. Better to obey than sacrifice. And it still applies today. Better to obey than sacrifice. And of course Samuel took a sword immediately and killed the king, the Amalekite king that Saul spared. But nonetheless, some of the Amalekites escaped Saul's hands, and as a result, we have Haman today, or had Haman later. Yeah, incredible story. Yeah. Any other questions?
After they were named, is she understanding that if he can do that, like again, like for the future a man?
Well, it is interesting that they had already hung Haman prior to that, and it sounds like to me that they had killed the 10 sons and then later hung them anyway for observance or whatever. They were hung later on. But yeah, it could be a tie back to the very far future of Hitler and his henchmen, his 10 henchmen. It could be related to that too, that history was going to repeat itself, 16, 1700 years later. So very possible. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, let's enjoy Hamantash and cookies that Misty baked for us. Yay! Yeah, yay for Misty. And I know you're watching, Misty. Thank you for the cookies, Misty. She never wants to get accolades, so I like to rub it in when I can. All right. Very good, everybody. Let's go get some cookies.